thank you so much for inviting us. This is joint work with Slava Mehed, who's sitting over there, and Sumit Agarwal. Before I start, I just want to congratulate these guys at HEC for this new center. For a long time, I've thought that there's this very little Canadian, there was until now, little Canadian institutional support for people to doing household finance compared to the US and many other countries. So this fills a really big gap, and I noticed that this is the first, you said this is the first household finance conference. Hopefully it's the first of very many. So congratulations for those guys. Okay, so we're doing stuff on peer effects and financial distress. The starting point is massive literature on peer effects and consumption. My neighbor buys a Ferrari, I want to buy a Ferrari. And there's lots of theories and hypotheses, keeping up with the Joneses, conspicuous consumption, many, many papers. These are just two ARs of many looking at peer effects and consumption. I buy something because my neighbor buys something. But more recently, there's been a step forward or an extension of this story, which is, okay, if there's peer effects in consumption, then maybe the peer who's following the neighbor gets into financial trouble. Maybe because I buy the Ferrari, I start going into financial distress or maybe even bankruptcy. And so there's a bunch of papers, well, two particular papers, George Irakis in RFS and Bertrand and Morris in RE Stat in the last couple of years, asking the question, if there's peer effects in consumption, does this lead to financial distress? And these papers, what we do in this paper is we address the same question. But both of these two papers are not really, haven't got that much causal evidence. The Bertrand and Morris paper is, as they say, correlational. The George Irakis papers has some causal stuff going in. What our contribution is, we hope, is to give you some more causal evidence on if there's peer effects in consumption and I get into financial distress, is this causal? And what we're going to do is our causal mechanism is we're going to use lottery wins. What we have is a very large database from one particular Canadian province. We have the universe of every single lottery win from the Provincial Lottery Organization, which, by the way, I'm not allowed to tell you which province this is.
But you're from Alberta.
I have no comment. They can sue me. And we're going to look at this. We're going to look at the lottery wins, and we're going to look at the repercussion. The outcome variable is bankruptcies. And both of these two databases, lotteries and bankruptcies, are very, very rich to the extent that for both of these databases we can see the full name and the full address of every individual who wins the lottery and who files for bankruptcy. So therefore we can do this really, really tight matching. We know exactly who wins the lottery and we know exactly who their neighbors are. So this is a big advantage of using this Canadian data. For example, the Canadian bankruptcy data is richer and is cleaner in many regards than US data, and I'll tell you why down the road. Okay, so that's the paper. And what we find is that, the bottom line, if you win the lottery, your neighbor, if the size of the lottery that you win determines whether or not your neighbor goes bankrupt. But before we get into the guts of the paper, the first issue that every peer effects paper has to think about is identification, the famous reflection problem of Mansky. And there's many, many papers on peer effects and many, many kinds of solutions to the reflection problem. What we do is a particular mechanism to address before I tell you what the mechanism, the reflection problem is basically, if you've got some peers impacting other peers, it's hard to disentangle which peer is impacting which. So you've got to figure out, to figure out causality, you have to have a nice clean mechanism that the causal flow is going from one peer to the other peer. So what we do in our setup is we look at very small neighborhoods. And for those Canadians in the room, our neighborhoods are 6-digit postcodes, which are very, very tiny. And what our mechanism, what our identification strategy is, it basically says we're only going to look at neighborhoods where there's exactly one lottery win in the neighborhood. Okay? And so we look at and we know the name and address of the lottery winner, and we can also know the name and address of all the other guys in the neighborhood who we know, by definition, did not win the lottery. So we know that the causality flows from the winner to all the other neighbors who didn't win the lottery. And then what we call this is a one-to-many strategy. The second element of our identification is this business here, comparing the size, the magnitude of the winners. So what we have in our data, which, as I said, is the universe of lottery winners, the critical thing is we know the dollar value of the lottery win. We can see, did the person win $1,000 or did the person win $1 million? So what our strategy is we generate these neighborhoods where, by definition, there's only one winner, and then so everybody has only one winner, and then our identification, our exogenous variation, is the size of the win. So here's a quick example. Philippe is sitting right there. Andrew is sitting over there. This is Philippe's neighborhood. These 5 guys sitting here. Philippe wins $1,000. Okay. Andrew also wins, but he wins $1 million. And this is, you happy?
There's no wealth in Quebec. Yeah.
No, this is random. Andrew wins $1 million. So what's the identification? I'm going to look at Philippe's $1,000. What does that happen to his neighbors compared to Andrew's $1 million and his neighbors? So that's the whole paper. And we're going to use this identification again and again and again in different contexts. Okay, so this is the map. This is a map of Canada, or a very tiny neighborhood of Canada. This gives you a sense of the magnitudes of what we're dealing with. Every one of these little squares is one house. Okay, and that star is the lottery winner. So we know exactly the guy where he lives in that star. These different colors, sort of the pink and the yellow and the purple, is a Canadian 6-digit postcode. For the people who live in Canada, they know that Canadian postcodes are really, really tiny. Turns out, depending on how you measure, there's approximately the median is about 13 houses in each postcode. If you look at multi-story apartment buildings, very often every story is a different postcode. And we can observe that, and that's our identification. That's what we use for identification. So there's and those are the neighbors, and we can see that. So the first geographic unit of analysis is each separate color. In this case, just the pink guys, compared to the guy who wins the prize. We then have a slightly bigger geography, which is what Canadians call a dissemination area. And where does the word dissemination area come from? This is basically a Canada Post definition, and it's typically the geography where a single letter carrier postal delivery guy can walk in his or her route. Okay? So it's very small. Why is this important? Because we have Canadian census data, very rich, everything you can see in the census. Age, income, immigration, gender, education, marital status, everything we can see at the census level, we can see at these slightly bigger geographies called the DA. And so we have about 25 of these observables of the neighborhood, which we're going to explore. So, what we do is the next thing we can do is we can use this neighborhood as if you like, a treated group, and compare it to these larger neighborhoods. And this leads to a geography, to a mechanism that John Campbell and others have used for many years. When you're looking at these very tiny geographies, you can difference out this inner ring minus the outer rings to take out neighborhood level observables. And many people have done that. Okay, so we have multiple levels of exogeneity going on. We have the randomized shock of the size of the lottery win. We have the different kinds of geographies netting out from each other, etc. This is the data. I've told you this. We can see everybody. Here's the data of the lotteries. You can see we have a large chunk of lotteries, of lottery wins, $1,000 to $3,000. The frequencies, so up there. We then have a very long tail. And in fact, we end this table here at 150,000. The largest win in our data is something like 41 million. So we have a very long tail, which we have to deal with. Okay, so let's look at the evidence for identification assumptions. We have to persuade you that the fact that Philip got $1,000 and Andrew got $1 million is unrelated to any kind of neighborhood observable. In other words, if only rich people won $1 million, then my identification strategy would be a problem. So we can do that quite easily. Remember, we have 25 different neighborhood level observables. So what we do is we divide up the size of the lottery wins, small, medium, large wins, and we plot them against these neighborhood level characteristics, and we hope that these lines are more or less identical. They overlap. And we do this for medium DA. We'd also do this more rigorously using regression, but this is a nice picture. What we can see is completely random. Similarly, we do the same thing for population density, completely random. There's no impact on the observable on the size of the win, the $1,000 or the $1 million, which is what we critically care about. We do the same thing for high school, and we do the same thing for 25 different observable variables. In each case, pretty strong evidence this is as good as random. Okay, so here's our main test. We have one main test, and then we have a whole bunch of subsidiary tests. This simply does, using this identification, Philippe gets 1,000, Andrew gets 1 million, and their neighbors, we just count how many bankruptcies in the neighborhood, and we do, here's the results. Pre-variables, they're all insignificant. Post, after the shock of the lottery win, what we find is that this is evidence in the year bucket 0 to 2, 3 to 5. If Andrew wins $1 million, there will be more people in his neighborhood that go bankrupt compared to Philippe's neighborhood, he only won $1,000. And the size of the magnitudes, very, very small. Significant, but as you would expect, quite small. So what we do is we take the average income in our neighborhoods. Canadian census tells us it's 29,000. We plug that number in. So this is, if you win the lottery, the size of the annual income. It's a big lottery. What we find is the number of bankruptcies increased by 0.03, which is about a 6% or so increase on the number of bankruptcies there are. And remember that bankruptcies are a very rare event in these small neighborhoods. So to emphasize, the effect size is very small but significant, which is not surprising. Okay, and then we do the placebo test. This is sort of like the John Campbell kind of test. Yeah.
Just very quick, can you separate the lottery winner going bankrupt from his neighbors going
yes.
bankrupt? Okay.
We don't talk about that because there's a paper already published by PageSteber in RE Stat. But we do that and we find nothing. So this is the test on not the close neighborhoods, not these 5 guys sitting here, but the slightly further away guys who live within a mile or so from Philippe, and we find that Martin and his neighbors there's no impact of Philippe on Martin who are further away, which is what we want. Okay, now, so Martin is not going bankrupt. He's just Stefan. Okay, so that's the headline. That's the main story. We found an impact. Now let's try and spend the rest of the 21 minutes left telling you about why and what's going on. What are the mechanisms? And I'm going to tell you 2 things. I'm going to start getting you thinking about different mechanisms as to why. And we're also going to ask a second question. How do the banks start responding? Because the banks can see this. And do they in fact respond? I'll come to the banks in a few minutes. But firstly, let's look at some mechanisms. And there's a massive literature on the different kinds of mechanisms of why peer effects should matter. Conspicuous consumption, financial risk-taking, which basically says, Martin wins $1 million, does his neighbor John, he's really upset with that Martin won, he wants to also buy the Ferrari, so he takes big financial risks, and then he goes bankrupt. So we can do that. We can also, the third thing we're going to look at is increased borrowing. We can actually measure, if Martin wins if if Andrew wins the $1 million, do his neighbors actually borrow some more in order to keep up with him? So these are the different mechanisms we're going to look at. Conspicuous consumption, going back to Veblen and Dusenberry, as we all know. What we have in our data, which we believe is really rich, is the day you file for bankruptcy, in the Canadian context, you have to go before the judge or the court and provide your full balance sheet. All of your assets and all of your liabilities you give to the judge. And this is a completely public document, which is dealt with by an organization in Ottawa, the Canadian government, something called the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, which is part of Industry Canada. Every single Canadian bankruptcy has to go to this, the filing goes to this office in Ottawa, and we have the full universe of this data. So to repeat, we have the universe of Canadian bankruptcies, and for every one of them we can see the full balance sheet, all the assets, all the liabilities, which is very, very rich compared to many other countries. For example, in the United States, they don't have a single bankruptcy office. There's 96 or something different bankruptcy courts. Everyone has a different setup, which makes doing this kind of research much, much harder. People have done it, but it's much harder. So we're now going to start exploiting this balance sheet data that we have. Okay, so the first question we're asking is conspicuous consumption. What does that say? This is my Ferrari. If my neighbor buys a Ferrari, I also want to buy a Ferrari that everybody can see. So the essence of conspicuous consumption is the notion that assets are visible versus assets that are invisible. If you buy something that nobody can see, that's not conspicuous. So what do we look at? And so this is the identical test that we had before, except the left-hand side is different. This is still Philippe $1,000, Andrew $1 million. We're looking at the neighbors who are going bankrupt. But now our left-hand side variable is how much money did you report on your balance sheet for these different kinds of assets? And we're making the assertion that things like cars and houses are quite visible. Your neighbors can see them. Things like furniture are less visible because they're indoors. We're not sure about recreational equipment. Some of it might be visible or not. But so what we look at is we run this regression, not how many bankruptcies, but for those guys who went bankrupt, what was on their balance sheet. And lo and behold, and again, here's the pre-years, we find nothing, the post-years. We're finding, especially in the 0 to 2 years, if you went bankrupt 0 to 2 years after your neighbor wins the lottery, there's a significant increase in the dollar value of car that you report to the judge on the day you go bankrupt. Similarly for houses, which we're arguing is more visible, we don't find that kind of stuff for things like furniture. We think this is some sort of intuition, some sort of support for the notion of conspicuous consumption and the notion of visibility. Visible assets versus less visible. So that's number one. The second hypothesis, and these things are not mutually exclusive. The second mechanism that we're trying to tease out is the stuff I was just talking about, John, a few minutes ago. If your neighbor wins the lottery, you take more risks to try and catch up with your neighbor and then that leads you into bankruptcy. And so we can use, to do this thing, we do this, the identical test, but we're now looking at other elements on the balance sheet. And again, these are all assets on the balance sheet on the day you file for bankruptcy. Just a key point about this, we can only observe your balance sheet on one day, which is the day you file for bankruptcy. So we have no panel here, but on that day, what we find is securities are significant both at 0 to 2 and 3 to 5. So again, what are we saying? That for the neighbors of Andrew, when they file, he won $1 million. When they file for bankruptcy, they are likely to have more positive financial securities, but there's no impact on cash, which is a low risk thing, or insurance and pensions, which is actually negative side. So again, this is not mutually exclusive to the conspicuous consumption story. We're finding some evidence of financial risk taking as a mechanism leading to bankruptcy and financial distress. Okay, now let's ask a different question. As I mentioned before, it's an even simpler question. When Andrew wins $1 million, do his neighbors take more debt? Okay, compared to the neighbors of Philippe, who only won $1,000. And this is a mechanism that is highlighted by the literature, who have said, this debt accumulation is a really important issue, and it's quite hard to capture. We actually capture this in two separate databases. One is the database that I spent the last 10 minutes talking to you about, which is the bankruptcy, on the day you file for bankruptcy. The second, which I'll talk about in a few seconds, is we add to this a whole new database on Canadian Credit Bureau data, which measures from the credit bureaus, which measures what's going on in the neighborhood. But I'll talk about that in a few seconds. Firstly, again, this is the identical regression, the identical identification strategy again and again. Philippe wins 1,000, Andrew wins 1,000,000, and these are the liabilities. This is the liability side of your balance sheet on the day you file for bankruptcy, and we can measure things like total debt, secured debt, unsecured debt. We divide it by many things. We can divide it by assets. We can divide ratios of total to so we have measures of absolute and relative. And what we are finding, and again, the pre-years or insignificant, the post-years, we're finding for secured debt in particular, in 0 to 2 years, both in relative and in absolute terms, we're finding effects. So in other words, debt seems to matter. Now, let's ask the same question with a whole new database. So what we did is we got hold of, we paid for Canadian Credit Bureau data. Now, many of you have used or know about the New York Fed version of the Credit Bureau data. That's many papers have been written about the New York Fed Credit Bureau data. This is the identical data. In other words, what Credit Bureau, the people who figure out your FICO score, and it's all the data that goes into calculating your FICO score. So it's from all the liabilities across the financial different institutions, and they aggregate this. We have one big exception to our data compared to the New York Fed data, is that the New York Fed Credit Bureau data is a 5% sample, which is fine in many contexts. Okay, 1 in 20 observations. However, in our context, once you're looking at neighborhoods, remember there's only 13 houses median in a neighborhood. If you have only 5%, you have, 1.5 people in your neighborhood that you can observe. So what we have, which is really important in our neighborhood context, we have we paid for the universe of credit bureau data for this particular one Canadian province. All the rest is the same as the New York Fed, annual panel data, types of liabilities. We can see number of accounts, total value of different accounts, etc. There's the specification. The summing up of this kind of stuff is once again, so just to emphasize what we're doing here. The previous stuff was only looking at the people who went bankrupt in the neighborhood. Now I'm looking at everybody in the neighborhood who has a credit file, which is pretty much everybody. Total debt increase, so 10% increase in the lottery win size. So the identification is still identical. It's still, for the 100th time, Philippe $1,000, Andrew $1,000,000. However, now we're looking at all the neighbors, and these amounts are small but significant, as we would expect. Total debt balances increased by 0.2 for a 10% increase in lottery win size. Bank cards increased by that small number, card balances by that, card limits. We also find impacts for car loans and installment credit. So the bottom line from this part of the paper is we provide evidence using two different types of data, bankruptcy data and credit bureau data, utterly different. Both of them are giving us the story that, that the neighbors after the big lottery win are increasing the amount of debt outstanding. Okay, now let's change gears. I have 10 minutes left. So for the last 10 minutes, I haven't mentioned until this point the banks or the creditors in this story. So the question arises, if you're a bank and you're lending money to, or you're lending debt to all of these people, do you care about, do you think about the fact that Andrew won $1,000,000? Does it even enter your consciousness? And do you, if so, do you react in a different kind of way? So what we are doing now in the last part of the paper is different factors that the banks can take or to provide evidence of how the banks might respond to this shock of Andrew winning $1 million. And we're looking at two things that we can measure. Firstly, which we can measure is, remember, we know the exact geography of the location of every single lottery winner. We know precisely where Philippe lives. Okay? And we can also measure, which is quite easy, the location of every bank. So we care about the soft information hypothesis, which says if a bank is close by, if it's in the same neighborhood, the bank manager knows what's cooking in his neighborhood or her neighborhood, and they can respond in their very neighborhood-specific kind of things. And the corollary is if the bank is far away from the neighborhood, they're less likely to know that Philippe or Andrew won a lottery, so there will be less response in that case. And then I'll talk about credit scores in a few seconds. But firstly, the soft information story. So what we do is and there's no magic number as to where does soft information kick in. There's lots of papers out there with empirical evidence. So we look at two reasonably small distances, 0.5 kilometer, 1 kilometer. And we're looking at this story is there a difference if there's a bank close by or if there's not a bank close by, which is defined by that. And here's the results. Again, this is the identical specification that I've been using for the last hour and a half. This feels like it. So again, it's small win, large win, looking at the neighbors. But now we are slicing by distance from the closest bank. So let's first look at the 0.5 kilometer guys, which is above the line, and then we look at the 1 kilometers, which is below the line. And again, these are the pre's, these are the posts. Nothing is happening pre. We're looking at post from after 0. If there's no financial institution close by, we find that our story is still there. In fact, it's even getting stronger. However, if there is a financial institution within 0.5 kilometer, the results go away. So this is very consistent with soft information. What does it imply? It implies that if the bank manager is 0.5 kilometer from where Philippe and Andrew live, they know what's cooking in their neighborhood. They can maybe address this issue. But if the bank manager is far away, we still see the result, our main results, our main story. And we do the same thing with 1 kilometer, and the results are essentially the same. Okay. So that's the soft information story. Now let's do a different test. Again, we're asking the question, how do the banks respond to all of this stuff? So let's look at who do the banks lend to after the shock. And we can see this because we have credit bureau data, which gives us the FICO score at the date of the lottery win. And we do a very rough segmentation into prime, more than 660, and subprime. And what we would expect, what the question we are asking is, if you're a bank and you see that Andrew has won $1 million, and you're nervous about Andrew winning $1 million, especially about his neighbors, you will be particularly nervous to those of his neighbors who are subprime. So what we want to do is to say, is there what we would expect is that there would be more of an impact from the prime guys rather than the subprime guys if the banks are worried about the subprime neighbors of Andrew. So, and this is exactly what we find. I'm not going to show you, I didn't show you the full, there's many tables in the paper, but we find that the banks use this prime-subprime mechanism to try and protect themselves from Andrew winning $1 million. Okay, last point. Now, I've given you lots of stories. We've given you different mechanisms, conspicuous consumption. I've given you different ways the banks respond. The last thing we do is we ask the question, what else could be cooking? What else could be going on that explains, that might possibly explain, and what can we rule out? And for this part of our paper is we exploit a really rich element of Canadian bankruptcy filing documentation which we have access to. And this is in every single bankruptcy filing. Remember, it's the same file across Canada, goes to the same office in Ottawa, which we have access to. They ask the textual question, give reasons for your financial distress. And people write. all kinds of stuff. And we have access to that text. Why do they get into trouble? And actually the guys in Ottawa, the Office of Superintendent of Bankruptcy did this. They did the textual analysis, and they divided these textual answers into 17 categories, which I'll show you. Here's the categories: marital breakdown, unemployment, business failure, tax, bad loans, legal actions, substance abuse, student loans, supporting relatives, all that stuff. Okay. Why do we care about this? Because let's say one of the big ones is marital breakdown as a reason for bankruptcy. We know this. There's lots of evidence that marital breakdown causes bankruptcy. If what we were picking up was Andrew wins $1 million, this leads to people going bankrupt. Sorry, let me rephrase. Andrew wins $1 million, this leads to people getting divorced, which in turn leads to bankruptcy. Then that's a whole different story than the ones we're selling, okay? So we need to cut that out, we need to rule that out. So what we can do is we can use this very rich textual data to rule out those kind of things. And so we run the identical specification again and again and again, except on the left-hand side now is this dummy variable. Did you include one of these many variables as a reason? And we find everything insignificant. That one is highly significant, but the wrong sign. So we're ignoring that. So we can, what it means is that for example, marital breakdown, we can rule out that when Andrew wins $1 million, all his neighbors get divorced, which causes bankruptcy. Because they're not reporting that marital breakdown was the cause of their bankruptcy. There's one really interesting one, which is the one I've highlighted, gambling. Okay? We often have got the question, if Andrew wins $1 million, maybe all his neighbors who are sitting next to him have this false, irrational belief that, quote, good luck transmits. Andrew wins $1 million, then the guy, John, sitting next to him also thinks, I'm going to win $1 million too. Okay, I'm going to gamble a lot. And because I'm going to gamble a lot, I'm going to then go bankrupt. Okay? So this is a very nice testable hypothesis, and we can test this because we have, and I think this is pretty unique in this kind of literature. We have it's unique in the gambling literature. We have a measure of did gambling in itself cause the outcome that we care about, and what we have here is everything's insignificant, so we can rule that thing out. So that's the story. 2 minutes left, so great time. Okay, so just to sum up, what do we find? What's new? What we think is new is it's a question that other people have asked, Bertrand and Morse and Georgiakis and others in recent times. We think we have really pushed and pinned down the causal mechanism. So our main result is we find that the neighbors go bankrupt. We then have evidence for all of these, not mutually exclusive. They're all happening at the same time. We can find evidence of conspicuous consumption. You know, we saw more visible stuff, the house and the car, versus less visible stuff, the furniture. We also found evidence of financial risk-taking. You know, we looked at the balance sheets and we find that the neighbors of Andrew are more likely to hold financial assets, not and cash is insignificant. We know there's increased borrowing in the neighborhood, both from our balance sheet data, from the bankruptcy balance sheet data, as well as from the new database, which is the credit bureau data. We then have these various mitigating factors. What do the banks do to try and stop this bad stuff happening, people going bankrupt? We find soft information data, so evidence for soft information, and we find the difference between prime and subprime. So banks dividing up based on observables at the date of the lottery. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me discuss this paper. So I had this paper in my hands 2.5 years ago. And I promised myself not to look at the slides, so if I repeat myself, it's not because I'm reusing the slides. I haven't looked at the slides. The advantage of seeing a paper later on is that you see how mature it gets and how much change. I'm not going to take credibility for 38 tables and 68 figures or something like that, and a 110-page long paper. I think referees has been involved in that.
What, you 2 years ago?
No. Apparently none. I can't remember what I said 2 years ago, but I do remember the page. So, in summary, what this paper does and what I'm going to discuss and give some thought about it is, what does it actually tell us about changing in debt behavior? So it builds on a literature that uses lottery prices to get a causal wealth effects. Whether you call it income or wealth effects, to me it's the same. So we have Swedish data that looks at lottery, we have Finnish data, and now we also have Canadian data that uses lottery prices as an exogenous variation to the beauty or the novelty about this paper is that it looks at the debt side. So what I'm going to do with my comments is I'm going to be a little bit into what else can we look at, and then going to be a little bit bitchy because I'm allowed to do this because the paper is so far as it's friendly bitchy. Okay, so the identification works this way. So say that you have two areas of neighborhoods, and what you're interested in is how the peer effect of wealth works on the neighbors in the area. So you have one lottery price of $1,000 and one of $100, and then you look at how does this change the behavior or the allocation of the neighbors. That's sort of the clean end of data that we want to end up with. Of course, this all doesn't always happen. So these are the huge sample of 2,500. We could also have an area where there is two prices. I'm going to go back to why some of these examples are important when I talk about the identification and some of the things that I would think would be interesting to look at. So we're going to dump this out of the data, because if you have two prices in the periods, you're going to have conspiracies, two shops at the same time, so you don't know what you're comparing. The second kind of data that is, initially when I read the paper, it sounded like this data is getting thrown out, but apparently it's not. So when I read the appendix on page 103, it says that it's actually included. So what happens if somebody in the area wins $1 million, they're poor, and they decide to move to a different neighborhood. So in this data set, the neighbor stays in there because there's a claim that there's still a causal effect of the person who moved out. That's fine, it's not. It's just that when I look at the data in the regression, it ends up at 2,500. So it's about a third of the data that is left. I'm going to go back to that why in the bitchy comments and things. And then I'm going to sort of look at two outcomes that I found very interesting and very sort of, I could argue, difficult. So first comment on something that I think would be very interesting to look at is, there's a claim in this paper that one of the challenges of identifying this is the possibility of unassertable choices, that after the lottery win, the winners may be systematically less likely to increase the demand for credit relative to the neighbors, specifically because of the increased financial resources, blah, blah, blah. And then say if this is the case, it will bias our estimates downward. Okay, so let's say I'm going to claim that, or at least somebody in so Jesper knows this, is a sign on one of the doors in our department saying that gambling is a taxation of the stupid. So it's sort of a classical example. So let's say that the people who gamble are financially stupid. I'm gambling, so hopefully that's not true, but let's just say it. And these people win a prize. Now, before they couldn't afford the car, the Tesla in Denmark at $200,000 because there was a down payment on $20,000. Now I want $20,000 and I'm financially illiterate. I go and buy the Tesla even though I can't carry the cost of running the Tesla. Now, because I've gotten this money, I'm now increasing my demand for credit because now I can put down the down payment. Right? And I think if that is the case, then that is a challenge. But it's not a challenge for not being interesting, it's an interesting story, right? That maybe the lottery winners will end up being worse off. And maybe the neighborhoods will also be affected by this. One of the interesting things I want to sort of dig at here is, does the debt to income goes up for those who win or the neighborhood? So I think that would be, I think that story is actually more, unless you win a lot of money, then the demand for credit usually goes up with wealth and income, and not the other way around. So, okay, so what if two? So I come from a country with full recourse. So when I was reading the section about the bankruptcy and the bankruptcy filing, and an argument about we can look at how much risky assets people have when they go bankrupt or default on their debt, I'm going, why do you have any assets at all? Like, why don't you get rid of everything? So my intuition is I'm looking at is that is there a story I identified, a really neat story of why actually people leave money on the table? Or is the institutional setup in Canada such that you can actually reclaim some of it? So one of the arguments is there's no effect on the house, there's an effect on cars, etc., etc. So maybe the things that are left is what is collateral money, right? So I don't know how it works in Canada, but in Denmark, if you have a car and use that as collateral, you can't use it as collateral again, right? So the reason why it will end up in the bankruptcy sheet in the end is because you can't borrow against it anymore. Actually, what we do see in the Danish data on bankruptcy is that when you look at the legal documents, people make a run for it for the last 3 or 4 days, right? So I can see people, you can use your house as a collateral. If you go to enough banks within the 3 days, you can get 10 times the mortgage, because before it's actually stamped, you can get the cash out, right? So I need to, so when I read this paper, and I think that's an extremely interesting story what this balance sheet tells about strategic behavior. Super. Now the bit sheet. Econometrics, because hopefully you're going to use this for something else as well. So here's for this identification to work, the size of the lottery has to be random. So that's where the identification comes from. And even you kept saying that the size of the neighborhood is about 13. That's a median size. Right? So there's probably actually nowhere in the paper does it say mean or standard deviation of the size of the neighborhoods. And to me, that was like, okay, so maybe if there's a huge neighborhood, or some huge, it's probably tail distribution, right? Then there's actually a correlation between the probability of winning 2 prizes, and therefore there will be some things that are explaining the size of the neighborhood and what prices comes out of it. So when you do all this, you do it by the density. So one could maybe say the density would be okay if you did a model where you're looking at the fraction of defaulting, but you're looking at the count. Does that make sense? So you have a count model and you're not controlling for the size of the neighborhood that they're in. Okay. A different thing is that if you look at a different argument, so when you do this table, you probably do it for a different paper, is that when I look at the effect, this is too tiny. So the effect, the significant effect actually comes from the third year. In all of the tables, when I looked at it, and that's the risk of providing 250 tables is so you can find out what goes on in the data, right? Is when the risk or the result is driven by the third year, why are all the tests done on this year 0? So if all of your results is coming from the third year behavior, and the argument that you have in the paper, which I fully agree on, is that if I see my neighbor buy a Ferrari, I buy a Ferrari. It'll take a couple of years before I go broke with a Ferrari, right? So that's, I would do these tests, whether they're random, and by sure it will be random still, but it's just much more convincing if you do the tests with the data that will drive the results. Okay, that was it. So again, beautiful identification, beautiful paper. I think the bankruptcy has some really interesting stuff in it.
So we have a few minutes for you, Barry, to respond and to take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Stefan. These are wonderful comments. John.
Yeah, I'm a little puzzled by the result about financial securities on the balance sheet and how that's consistent with a risk-taking story. I guess I would think if you buy financial securities, you take a risk, and then your risks go bad, and that's why you go bankrupt. You would be left with nothing at the bankruptcy date because you bought penny stocks and they lost money. So it's obviously telling you something, but I'm not sure it's telling you a risk-taking leads to bankruptcy story.
I think that's a great comment. I have no response. I think that's right.
And
I suppose my one response is risk that stuff compared to cash. We find nothing on cash.
Right.
So that, but a great comment.
And then my other reaction to one of Stefan's point, that it's quite plausible that winners, in fact, take out more debt. I think that's right. I'm at a conference in a couple of weeks. I have to discuss a paper that's looking at mineral royalty payments for shale gas drilling, which you can think of as winning the lottery equivalent. And the result there is that owners of these mineral rights who start with a prime credit score actually take on more debt. If they start with subprime, then they pay off their debts. But
So,
plausibly what's happening is, they're buying cars, they're taking on debt to collateralize the purchase of expensive durable goods.
so the quick response is, it's the same response to that I gave from Martin during the talk. We have the data on the individual. The whole focus on this story was the neighbors, and we, in essentially the paper, as Stefan said, it's so huge already. So we ignored the actual winners themselves going bankrupt. But we've done all of these tests, and the reason why we're not including it is the quick answer is that PageScheber has an RE stat on exactly that question. If you win the lottery, do you go bankrupt? Ignoring neighbors. So, but John, these are great points, and we can absolutely do that quite easily, and tease out whether that's the mechanism that we seek. So thank you so much.
So I'm wondering if you've thought about connecting it to the happiness literature. And so we know from the happiness literature that the wealth of your neighbors negatively impacts your happiness. And so I'm just wondering, it would be really interesting if you'd see any impact with depression. Sort of
I
withdrawing
would
from the
love to do
laboratories.
that. I don't believe we can measure happiness at these tiny little neighborhoods. And I'm trying really hard to get hospital data, but it's really tough. But if I could measure prescription drugs for depression in these tiny neighborhoods, there's a whole new paper. I love that.
So one other idea would be if you could see the Canadian equivalent of Social Security disability. So in the U.S. it's primarily depression and back pain. So if you could look at that.
Great idea. I haven't done that. Absolutely plausible. Thank you. Okay.
Just two comments. First on happiness, death to happiness measures, but I think the mental health stuff is extremely interesting. And in Canada, courtesy of the tobacco litigation, including Alberta, you are able in the RDCs to link medical records to great detail. So we can talk to you about that privately in about 4 or 5 years for various reasons.
We can only do it in 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, because the data is protected until the litigation is finished. But I can talk to you
I
about
love
that.
it. This is wonderful.
However, I now want to ask a question from the literature, the specialist gambling literature, in particular pathological gambling.
Yes.
Your final remark.
Yes.
There's a large literature in that literature that suggests that there are massive peer effects intra-family
Yes.
and within friends.
Yes.
They have not looked at the spatial connection, but close friends. So your result at the end that there was no effect
Yes.
sounds counterintuitive, but one of the things you have to be super careful about is if you think about gambling seriously as a psychological disorder, pathological gambling, you look at the Diagnostic Statistic Manual criteria, one of the criteria for being a pathological gambler is you don't talk about it. So when you ask people, what caused your distress? Well, it wasn't gambling. Duh. That's called a sample selection bias. So I think we need to be, if you want to actually look at the serious pathological gambling literature, one can't be so glib as to say they didn't mention it, because that's precisely the criteria that a pathological gambler exhibits. It's one of the criteria.
I love that. I agree completely. We have a really messy measure of gambling, so you're 100% right. My point was that I don't think in the whole literature on lottery winners, does anybody actually have data on any kind, let alone good kind, the kind you have, on was there a gambling problem amongst the lottery winners and the outcome of the lottery winners?
Yes. Yes, it's in New Zealand, it's in Australia, it's in Sweden. There's many countries that have it. Canada doesn't. There's some in Alberta, actually, because there's a large gambling institute at
Yes.
UA.
Who funded this paper?
Oh, good. Okay. Well, then they should be asking certain questions. But there are good data. There's some in Newfoundland and Labrador
Fantastic.
as well.
Let's talk. That's really, really rich. Thank you. Where do we go? Martin?
Yeah, just a few comments. First, going with what Stefan said. I think, as you know, you live where there are a lot of land, and the postal codes sometimes you have to drive to go see your neighbor. So I mean, in that case, it's kind of hard to say that there's a conspicuous effect if it takes you, if you need to walk a full kilometer to go see your neighbor. It's kind of, it's a bit harder to show your bling than if you're living in downtown Edmonton.
So the quick answer is we did that test, and it's one of the many tests we threw out because the paper was 105 pages already. So we did that. We split the sample based on rural, urban, based on and Canadian has Stats Canada has really great measures of rural, urban, 8 different measures, not just rural, urban, and we find that. I think I forgot what we found. To be honest, but we did that. We can, and one thing we can control for. Stefan said we can't control for some things, but one thing we can see absolutely perfectly is the people per square meter or square kilometer. So we plug that in everywhere.
Okay. Second thing, you have an impact on houses. How do you beautify a house? I mean, it's kind of hard to have the house value increase from your own doing. I've been trying for a while. Not because.
The 6 kids. Get rid of the 6 kids.
So again, so that's a great question, and we've thought about this a lot. The quick answer is we cannot. What is our bankruptcy data? It's one variable at one point in time on the day you file for bankruptcy. So all we are showing is that if, to go back to the age-old story of Andrew's neighbors, when they file for bankruptcy, they will have more of a house value than Philippe's neighbors. That's all we can show.
But it is
No. Let me rephrase that. So now let's get into the weeds of Canadian bankruptcy law. The value of the assets and the liabilities are reported by a person called a Canadian trustee, a bankruptcy trustee, who is often a chartered accountant, who is regulated by the courts and regulated by the authorities. And this person acts as what's called a friend of the court or something like that for both the debtor and the creditor. So this person is obligated to get the best value of your house based on the market conditions. So what's self-reported is the textual stuff, exactly this stuff. Why did you go bankrupt? Divorce, gambling. That's the only thing that's self-reported. All the rest is really good because it's not self-reported, it's out of this bankruptcy trustee. Yeah.
So I found your results about the distance from a bank to be somewhat, or at least your interpretation to be somewhat unclear. I will try to be constructive. So the first thing that came to mind was, well, if I have a bank in the neighborhood, they know me, that I want to borrow, I'm just going to go to a faraway bank. I can always go to a faraway bank. So I don't know if the soft information channel necessarily applies. And the second thing that came to mind is, maybe having a neighbor who is a banker may have a good influence on my behavior. But then I said, nah, bankers, how they like to do. And so the third thing I thought about was, maybe there are some areas with a lot of banks where people are likely to react differently. What do you think?
So the first 2 points I absolutely agree with. You know, we have a really not a great measure of soft information. It's just we're just slicing and dicing what we can see, and one of the things we can see is there a bank close by, and we find the effect goes away if there's a bank close by, which is sort of consistent with soft information. So I'm certainly not claiming this is the best test ever for soft information. Your final point, I just remind me what you said again, that if there's lots of bankers close by, this can change your behavior. Yes, that's correct, and this is consistent with what we find. If there's so I'm not claiming, maybe I was too loose in the way I was describing things. All we are finding is if there's a bank close by, the results go away. Whether it's the bank watching you or you being worried about the bank, I can't say. Either one is fine, or both are fine. There.
Two quick questions. Have you looked at consumer proposals as opposed to bankruptcies? Because that's the step beforehand and some people like that. Number two, could you tell us a little bit about how many people in Canada go bankrupt a year because of this effect? So it would have been 700 and it's 703, or it would have been 7,000 and instead it's 10,000. How many people a year in Canada go bankrupt because of what you identified?
Great. The second part is a great question, which we haven't done and we should do and we can do. The first thing about consumer proposals for the non-Canadians, think of chapter 7 and chapter 13, right? I forget, U.S. bankruptcy law. One of them is 13 or 7. I forget which one. Says you have a negotiation, and there's an outcome. And the other one is a full-on bankruptcy, which is a liquidation. So in our story, we deliberately we have all the data on proposals, and we have a series of papers on proposals. Different story. But the problem with the proposals, the negotiation, debtor credit negotiation, there's so much going on in the debtor credit negotiation. It's hard to disentangle all this effect. So for this story here, we're looking at the hard bankruptcy, a liquidation. The guy goes bankrupt, loses the house, blah blah blah, and we can see this very cleanly. So we can certainly do the proposal stuff. It's just too many degrees of freedom.
Doesn't the judge,
Sorry, again?
doesn't the judge decide whether the proposal is...
No, you decide. Judge does not decide. You decide, same as the US. You choose chapter 11, chapter 13, or chapter 7. Canada, you pick. This is the key point. The debtor picks whether to file and what chapter to file. Judge does not decide. Judge decides whether to approve the filing or not, and what you filed.
So in a similar spirit, would it be possible to measure the change in credit score among the neighbors?
Yes.
I mean, isn't that the obvious sign of deteriorating finances, perhaps mismanagement?
Did we do that?
debt?
That's
very
completely obvious, and I don't know why we didn't do that. And we can do it easily. So thank you. Yes, certainly can do that. I think we did that, but I forget. Any more?
All right, well, thank you all for
Thank you so much for your questions.